Shabbat Shalom. Rabbi Robert Barr here, and I'm delighted that you're joining me for this Shabbat service. We're living in challenging and difficult times, and this is a moment for us to step out of the chaos, to regain our perspective on where we've been and where we're going, to think about our values, ideas, and our principles. So put away the pencil and the paper, put away the notebook and the keys, set aside the shovel and hammer, rest. For this interval, no buying, no selling, no working, no laboring, no straining, not living in the past, not planning for the future. This is a time for celebration, for joy, for mirth. We are here alive to rejoice in another Sabbath, another opportunity to be together, grateful for our family and our friends. With no distractions, we touch and are touched, the great gift of the Sabbath. So I'm Rabbi Robert Barr of Congregation Beth Adam, our bricks and mortar congregation, and our Jewish community, our online congregation. We began an online congregation and began streaming more than 10 years ago. We did it because we wanted to stay connected with our students who may have moved to other cities, or members who moved, or people who've encountered us either here in Greater Cincinnati or learned about us in some other way. Our streaming service and our online congregation was a way to create community literally around the world. And now with the pandemic, it has become ever more important. It's a tool, however. What is core to who we are and what we do is the voice of Judaism that we give expression to at our Jewish community and our bricks and mortar congregation, Beth Adam. We've been working at creating a congregation. 40 years we started, and we've worked on our liturgy. We've refined it. We've talked about it to make sure it gives expression to who we are and what we value. Our ancestors spoke about who they were, what they value, what they thought, informed by the ideas of their age. And liturgy, just like us, needs to change. Judaism, the Jewish experience has evolved, but for many, the liturgy hasn't. We felt it was important to recreate the liturgy, making sure the values that we hold, values about the use of sciences, understanding our place in the universe, and human and personal responsibilities, recognizing that no divine hand is going to rescue us, needs to be part of the service. And that's what we've been doing for 40 years at Beth Adam and online at our Jewish community for over 10 years. And you're part of that community. I'm so pleased you're here. Let us know where you're participating from. It always is interesting and moving and meaningful to see the reach and to see where everyone is from. Let us know how you're doing. I know people are all struggling in different ways. I'm always concerned about everybody. We're all wrestling with this pandemic and the isolation in different ways. So share that and feel free to chat and do so in a welcoming and inclusive manner, because this is a community that welcomes and is inclusive. I also understand that many people don't watch our services live. I get it. 6 o'clock Eastern time may not be convenient for you. You may be working. You may live in another time zone. So whenever you participate, welcome and leave a note. It's always good. I always go back over a week and see who's joined us later, not live, but over the course of the week. So I'm really pleased you're here. We're going to continue our service with the lighting of the Shabbat candles. On this Shabbat, we create our moment in time. We pause to reflect upon our yesterdays and tomorrows, to renew our ties with family and friends, to restore our energies, to refresh our spirits. As the sun descends and shadows lengthen, the distraction of the day gives way to the stillness of night. It's time now for us to see not with our eyes, but with our hearts and our minds. As the day gives way to evening, it is time for us to welcome the Sabbath. The candles stand before us waiting to be lit. We recall our ancestors as we too seek to dispel the darkness and banish the cold, to bring glowing softness, warmth, and safety into our homes. May the dancing flames of these candles kindle warmth within our hearts, wisdom in our mind, passion in our souls. Baruch ha'or ba'olam, blessed is the light within the world. Baruch ha'or ba'adam, blessed is the light within each person. Baruch ha'or ba'Shabbat, blessed is the light of the Sabbath. one of the joys and opportunities that an online congregation and streaming services provides us is that I can interview people anywhere in the world. And so I reached out to a former study partner of mine. Many of you know that when I was at Hebrew Union College, studying in groups was really important. It helped me to get through. I had people to rely on. And one of my colleagues and friends who I studied with took a very different career path. So I hope you find my conversation with Rabbi Jeffrey Kahn as interesting as I found it, and the path that he's journeyed from here in Cincinnati, where we studied together, now to Washington, D.C., via Australia, Israel, and a couple other places. So it is my pleasure and my joy to welcome Rabbi Jeffrey Kahn to our Jewish community and to this streaming service. I first met Rabbi Kahn in 1976 in Jerusalem, where we were students at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. So welcome, Rabbi Kahn. I am so pleased that you are joining us tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar. It's a pleasure to almost be together, but at least to be on the same screen.
On the same screen. That's great. So you and your family are healthy. That's the first question I like to make sure.
Thank goodness. Thank God. Thank goodness we're all healthy and well and hanging in there.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, I wanted to talk to you because you've had a very interesting career. Recent, I think, let me just mention where you are right now. You own the medical marijuana shop.
My family and I own Tacoma Wellness Center, which is the first medical marijuana dispensary in Washington, D.C., and actually in the Mid-Atlantic region, one of the first on the East Coast. We're about to celebrate 7 years in business, and it's been quite an interesting experience.
So now that we got everyone interested in what you're doing now, I think it's fascinating how from the time we met in Jerusalem, when we were studying to be rabbis and we were study partners in Cincinnati, how your career path, it's been a very interesting one. So we went to the college together. How did you were a little bit older than I was, not to talk about age, but I recall you had a career in business before you came to HUC.
Well, kind of. Actually, although nearly 30 years in the rabbinate, I felt that I was out of business and in a different world, and maybe that was one of the reasons why I was interested in the rabbinate in the first place. But yes, I came from a strong entrepreneurial background, as they say, and my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather had been in the dress manufacturing business, and my father died very suddenly in 1971, and I was 19. And so for 2 years, my mother and I took over the business. I'd grown up in it and didn't make what I would say would be an outstanding success, didn't really know what we were doing, and decided that I really belonged in college, and then and eventually HUC and in the rabbinate.
And how did you decide to become a rabbi? Were you involved in your congregation a lot? Was it, how did that happen?
I wasn't much involved in my congregation at that time. I mean, I grew up in a religious school and many of the usuals of a classical Reform congregation. But I got to the University of Florida, and actually it was the fall of 1973 when I went back to college, and probably about 3 or 4 weeks into the term was the Yom Kippur War in Israel. Sure. And that kind of, and then the gas crisis and the things that happened in 73, that piqued my interest. And I became more and more interested. I took a course called Judaism, Protestantism, and Catholicism, taught by a Roman Catholic priest. And I felt like I learned more about Judaism than I learned about the other two. I already knew everything that they taught me in the class about that. I grew up in America, but growing up in I guess a classical Reform congregation, I didn't know a lot of stuff about Judaism. And probably towards the end of that year, I ventured into Hillel for the first time to see what that was all about, and and met somebody else who had ventured there for just about the first time, who I've been married to for 44 years, Stephanie, and that kind of began my interest in Judaism, and became very involved in Hillel and Israel affairs, and that kind of led me to a degree in Jewish history, and then to HUC.
That's right. So that's where we met. So and I met your wife there, Stephanie. I still have like bits and pieces, because in Jerusalem there was a little bit. We didn't study together. Your Hebrew was and remains far better than mine ever was. I recall that. So we had different classes. I was as sort of one of the lower classes. You were one of the more advanced. So we didn't study, but when we came to Cincinnati, we became study partners.
Yes.
And did that for a number of years, and then we were graduating or getting ready to be ordained, and we were looking for jobs. And you took a very interesting position. You want to talk about where you went? I still remember you leaving. I actually remember talking about it in the dining room when you got the offer to go and visit. Where'd you go?
Wow, I went to Adelaide, South Australia, and that's where I was for the first almost 6 years of my rabbinate. Which was a great experience. It's a congregation that's still in existence and served by a rabbi. So that's a success story in itself in some of these small, far-flung Jewish communities.
Right.
Thanks to the internet, and we're able to be in touch with many people from there now. And it was a fabulous experience. I was a rabbi. They were my first congregation. We kind of grew up and learned a lot together, and probably would have stayed there forever, except that we didn't have things like the internet and satellites, and we were pretty far away from family and friends, and it was time to come back.
Right. And we were just, my wife and I were just
That's right.
Terry's taught in Australia a couple times, and we went to Adelaide, and I found the street called Synagogue Place. I think I actually texted you from there because I was trying to was curious. There was nothing there. It was a relatively small street, but it's a relatively small town. It's beautiful. There are the great valleys where they grow wine. But it is, I mean, being in Australia is far, far away, particularly, in the early 80s. I mean, you were far from family, so you left there and you came back to the States, and you took a couple of different positions while you were here, as I recall.
Yes, well, we came back to Rockford, Illinois, where we were for 10 years, and that's where my kids grew up. And we remained there until 1996, when I had the opportunity to return to the congregation I grew up in Miami, Temple Israel of Greater Miami. And I served as their rabbi for 5 years. And thought then at the time, maybe one of the less, I don't know, but decided at the time that I didn't want to spend the rest of my career with an elderly congregation that was kind of fading, and that I needed young families and a different kind of congregations. So I decided to accept a position in New Jersey, and Warren Township, New Jersey, where I was for 6 years with at that time, a very large and active congregation. And at the end of 6 years, after 25 years, we received our Doctor of Divinities.
Right.
And I went to New York to receive mine because
I missed you when I got mine in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I missed my classmates, but I got mine in New York. And it was interesting because after that, I started thinking, teachers retire after 25 years. Police officers retire after 25 years. People in the military aren't there after 25 years. 25 years was really, a good number of years to do this. Maybe it was time to do something else. And my younger son, who was actually born in Australia, had made Aliyah and was living in Israel. And we sort of felt that he was living our dream ever since 76 and 77 when we were there with you. We had hoped one day to retire and go back to Israel, and so we did. And we purchased an apartment in Herzliya. And
I remember that apartment. I remember visiting you there. Great apartment.
And we really enjoyed being there. And I was working for several not-for-profit nonprofits helping to raise money in the U.S. For work in Israel, both interfaith work and medical kinds of things. And then in 2008, fundraising wasn't really a career for anyone.
2008.
And virtually sort of the same time, my older son was ordained a rabbi and accepted a position at the University of Maryland at the Hillel. And we decided that our family was all in the States. Our first grandson was in the States, and what were we doing in Israel? So we came back kind of temporarily to see what would happen. And here, over 10 years later, we're still here.
So wait a second, I want to set this up. So go to college, get excited about Judaism, get ordained, have this incredibly interesting, I said to you before we started talking, I've always been impressed with you that you were able to make these changes, because I've been in one pulpit. I'm tend to be one of the unusual ones to be in one pulpit all my entire career, and that you made these really dramatic changes, and that you were willing to take those risks. That change is risky. It's challenging. It's moving your family. Moving to. Just before I forget, the story that I remember when we were sitting in the dining hall at Hebrew Union College, and you were going to Australia, and we said to you, they're going to want you to preach a sermon when you get there. And you said, there's no way they're going to do that. It's back then, it was a long flight now, but back then it was an even a longer flight. And you had to take a small plane across from Sydney to Adelaide, which is, it's the size of America, and you tend to have motion sickness. And we said, you have to take some sermons because you're going to have to do that. And you said, after you came back, they got you off the plane and took you right to services and wanted to give you a sermon. I will never forget that story. And then you slept for a day. And you slept for a day, you said afterwards, because it was so exciting. But I do remember that. So you did that, you moved, and you moved to Israel and started at Stephanie. Obviously, she was working there. You created a life there. And then you came back to the States exploring. How did you go from all the work as clergy and in the not-for-profit world, and then go the medical marijuana shop? Because I think for lots of us, the rabbi who sells marijuana, I think the medical part gets sort of falls off, and we hear marijuana, which when you were doing it, this was when you started exploring this was before it was certainly, it was as it was being legalized. It was very, very early. You were really one of the entry into a world that most people didn't even know about. How did you figure? Why? First of all, why? What drew you to it more than how you did it? What drew you to it?
Well, an important part of the story is that my late father-in-law lived with multiple sclerosis for about 50 years. He grew up in this neighborhood that we live in Washington now, where our dispensary is, and he was first hospitalized in the 1950s and diagnosed in 1964. Really started to when we were married just before we went to Israel. So we were married in March 1976, just a couple of years before you guys. Right. And he with two crutches walked down the aisle at our wedding, but that was the last time I ever saw him walk. When we came back from Israel in 1977, he was really bedridden and remained so pretty much for the rest of his life. He passed away in 2005. And in the 70s, mostly, when he was still seemingly physically healthy and in a position where he could try and do whatever he could to try and cure his disease or at least live with it, he traveled the globe and tried just about everything that was possible. He saw doctors in 3 continents and tried pharmaceuticals that he had to go into rehab to get off of, and snake venom, and you name it, and he was willing to try it. And one physician in the 70s recommended cannabis, marijuana, which he wasn't about to do right away. I mean, first of all, he was a Korean War vet. He wasn't the kind of guy that was going to be smoking marijuana or looking for marijuana, and even if he wanted to, where would he find it? And how would he get it? But eventually, he did have the opportunity to try, and it made a huge difference in his life. At a time when there was virtually nothing that they could do to help with the pain and muscle spasticity of multiple sclerosis, this was really able to help him. And so he never lived at a time where it was easily accessible or legal, and so he didn't have a constant supply by any means. But we knew over the years that when he was able to access it, really made his life better. So that was something that we knew well. When I came back from, because of that, I guess, when we came back from Australia and went to Rockford, and we're adjusting to American life in the 80s, I went to a rabbi's meeting in Chicago, coming from Australia and being so starved for meeting with colleagues. My closest colleagues were 800 miles away in Melbourne, and so it wasn't something that we did often. But there was Chicago just an hour away, or an hour and a half away. So I went to a rabbi's meeting, and they were talking about the AIDS crisis, which I knew little about, and had no real experience with, and just the beginnings of what they were starting to see in a large Jewish community in the mid-'80s. And I said to colleagues, I don't even remember who they were. I said, I just came back from Australia. I'm in this tiny community in Northwest Illinois. There's 150 families in the congregation. They don't know anything about this or have any experience with this. And so one of the other rabbis said, just talk about it. Let them know that there's a crisis out there, and that you're somebody that people can talk to. And I did, and I was, for a small congregation, inundated with people that I had no idea had a child, had a brother, had a cousin, had an uncle, it had touched many of the families in my congregation, and I didn't even realize it. And so one of the things, and maybe it's part of your experience in Cincinnati to a certain extent, but one of my experiences in Rockford was that in a very conservative community, I guess the non-conservative people sort of come out and work together, and people who were living and dying with AIDS were having a tough time in Rockford. And Stephanie and I both became involved in the AIDS Care Network. She became vice president, I think, and I soon found that there were people in the hospitals who were living and dying with AIDS that clergy wouldn't come visit, that clergy weren't bearing. It seemed like a real long time ago until this pandemic that we were facing something like that. And what was interesting was that at the time when that nothing was able to help people dealing with AIDS or even HIV, people anecdotally found that marijuana helped.
So you realize that marijuana, both for your father-in-law with MS and for people who were suffering and dying of AIDS, marijuana was a pain relief, and it sort of perked your interest in how that could be and we shouldn't mention Stephanie, your wife, is a nurse. Yes.
So that's how she became involved with that mainly. And even when we went, I was recently, not too long ago, in Miami, where they were celebrating the beginning of our Pride Seder that we started there, and met folks in Miami when I was there from '96 to 2001, who I had visited folks in the hospital even then, where Miami rabbinic colleagues weren't visiting them. So I had even forgotten how recent that was, and how polarizing it was, and especially in the religious community. And so we found there that folks were self-medicating with cannabis and finding that it helps. And in fact, we had a law that allowed people to access cannabis legally and a compassionate care program that was begun during that period, that was canceled by the federal government because too many people with AIDS were applying for it, and they didn't want it to be that marijuana was helping people with AIDS. There's still 3 people who get 300 rolled marijuana cigarettes a month from the federal government because they were part of this federal program back in the 90s. But anyway, we started to see our first marijuana legislation, or attempt for legislation, to be to come from the AIDS community, and especially ACT UP, which was and still is an organization that works hard to find an end to AIDS. And the first medical marijuana law in California was passed in 1996. And although it didn't become the kind of marijuana industry that maybe we see in California today, but began seeing that people were being able to get relief. We in Washington, D.C. passed a similar law in 1998. So we had a medical marijuana law that was passed by the people, and this is generally the way things work here in D.C., that a member of Congress decided to block. That member of Congress was somebody that you might recall, a congressman from Georgia named Robert Barr. And so
thank you. No relationship.
I hope not. So we dealt with the Barr Amendment for 12 years, where every year when the Appropriations Act came up, Congressman Barr added a rider saying that, but DC couldn't put its medical marijuana program into effect. So we fast forward to our first Congress in 2009 under the Obama administration, and an appropriations bill is passed without the Barr Amendment. What happened was that several marijuana activist organizations hired retired Congressman Barr to be our advocate in Congress.
Wow.
To explain why it was important to take the rider off.
So interesting. So we got to end in a second, just time. Okay. We're going to have a second conversation because I think people are really intrigued with the second piece of this. So it sounds like, that you've always had, the word activist sounds strong, but you've always had, you've had a compassion reaching out to people in need, whether it was people with AIDS, HIV/AIDS, who are suffering, seeing your father-in-law. As a rabbi, you were using the pulpit to do that, to make the world better. And even in Israel, when you're doing not-for-profit, you had a sense of a bigger mission. It sounds like opening a medical marijuana dispensary really, while it for some people may sound jarring, it really is a natural progression of how can you, Jeffrey Kahn, Rabbi Kahn, and Stephanie, make the world a better place and make it less painful for people and help people live a better quality of life. And that while it may seem like, how's a rabbi selling marijuana? It really, when you tell the story, it seems incredibly natural.
I think so too. Thank you. And I think that, although, today you have marijuana dispensaries, medical marijuana dispensaries in Ohio, and probably folks in your congregation know people who go there or know people who work there, and it's not such a strange, unnatural, unbelievable kind of thing. But even just 10 years ago, it was, and so for a rabbi and a nurse to be involved, really, people paid more attention to us because most people in their 60s who are in the marijuana business spend part of that time in prison and the other part of that time following the Grateful Dead. They're not people who do what we did. So so we certainly stood out from the crowd, and I think that's what helped us in the beginning make this a success here in DC.
Well, thank you. We're going to pause and we're going to end this conversation now. We're going to have a second conversation because we want to understand what's it like to run a medical marijuana shop. What's the experience have been and the other pieces of it, because you've been in the political. So I really, really thank you that you're willing to share your experience, and I look forward to another conversation that we're going to have. So you take care, be safe, wash your hands, socially distant, and do all the things we need to do.
Will do. Thank you. You too.
Thanks. Quite a story, isn't it? That was part one. I will be sharing with you in a couple weeks part two of Rabbi Khan's story about what his life is like now, owning the medical marijuana dispensary. But we're going to continue our service right now with two more readings, a reading over the challah, a virtual challah, if you will. Hopefully, maybe you have some bread, and then a reading over wine or juice. As the fingers of the challah intertwine, so do we join hands in our common humanity, sharing the fruits of our labor. We cherish that which has been created through human effort, for it is through the work of our hands, the strength of the human spirit, the vision of our minds that our dreams are woven into the tapestry of time. We celebrate the accomplishments of yesterday and today, anticipating the possibilities of tomorrow. May the sharing of the challah strengthen our bond with others who walk upon this earth. Baruch Hamau Kapenu, blessed is the work of our hands. Baruch Hazon Ha'adam, blessed is the vision of our minds. Baruch Lechem Ha'aretz, blessed is the bread of the earth. And then if you have some juice or some wine, join with me. We celebrate the fruit of the vine and the bounty of nature as we lift the cup. For we are part of nature, which gave us birth and continues to sustain us. Even as we depend upon nature, so do we influence its course. Through the search for understanding, we have gained the knowledge to shape our world. Guided by the best of human wisdom and the compassion of our spirit, we accept the responsibility which rests upon us. May the taste of the juice or the wine upon our lips stir within us a reverence for nature and a respect for human endeavor. Ruchim chachayim ba'olam, blessed is the life within each person, Bruchim chachayim ba'olam, blessed is the life within the world. Bruchim chachayim ba'adam, blessed is the life within us. And so we say, l'chaim, to life. So those of you who have typically gone to our Jewish community website and click there to follow streaming service, you'll notice that we moved you, if you will, redirected you to Beth Adam's website. We've merged the two websites together. We recognized that we were creating new materials and posting them on Beth Adam's website on a regular basis, and we wanted you to participate and have access to them, see the other materials and other resources that we have, and to see how you could be engaged in different ways. We recognize that with everyone, both our bricks and mortar members and our online participants sort of merging right now, there may be opportunities that we want to explore. So this will give you a chance to do that. For sure, take a look at my the podcasts that I post. Those you can listen to them. There are also videos. You'll look, if you go click on each of the headers where it says learning, there's some drop-down menus about social justice work that we're doing, but also there are videos of conversations I've had with individuals, some that we've shared here and some that we haven't. There's a whole about race and race issues in America. There's a section about COVID and how we deal with the isolation, about grief, about love, about purpose. All these things are there for you to explore. I hope you look and enjoy, and I hope you join me next week when we have Shabbat services once more. And we conclude with those words we conclude with each week. May we know blessings those who are near, and may we know blessings those who are far. And may this Sabbath bring its goodness to everyone soon, wherever they are. Shabbat Shalom.